In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the common characteristics of a solid front-end developer that I myself would like to have on my team. Hey, my name is Khan, and I'm currently a front-end software engineer at a startup, and I've worked for companies like Sony and Google. Now, if you're thinking about getting into front-end development or are already a front-end developer, then this video is for you. I want to give you 5 guiding principles to help you become the type of front-end software developer that is sought out at companies. You have choices for where you get to work, and ultimately, you're the type of front-end expert that managers love to have on their team. Okay, let's dive in. Guiding principle number 1. The most important aspect of front-end development is JavaScript fundamentals. When I interview front-end developers, I don't necessarily test candidates on these things, but here are a few concepts I expect a JavaScript developer to know. Asynchronous programming, the single-threaded nature of JavaScript, the event loop, asynchronous callbacks, and promises. These are the bread and butter of day-to-day JavaScript. You should also be familiar with closure and higher order functions, prototypal inheritance, and ubiquitous ES6 features like classes and arrow functions. And one other thing that's important is how the keyword "this" actually works in JavaScript. Now, preparing your answer to these individual things is trivia knowledge that I think is not really relevant in most interviews. What I suggest though is to understand how these concepts are used in your day-to-day code, and that should be enough to brush up on any trivia questions that you do get, if any, in your interviews. A big red flag would be when I ask what these things are and the candidate is weak in their fundamentals or has no clue what I'm asking. You want to become very good at JavaScript. It'll make your life as a front-end developer so much easier. Guiding principle number 2 is to have a good grasp of CSS. Now, let me preface this by saying that CSS is one of those things that doesn't take too long to understand the basics, but it takes a very long time to get sufficiently comfortable and fluent in it. And that's because it's not like a programming language that's governed by the same principles and concepts that every language adheres to, like conditionals, loops, data structures, and algorithms. None of these things exist in CSS. CSS is more like a mechanism to describe what you see on the screen. And so the intuition and judgment for which rules to use, how to name stuff, and how to structure your HTML really comes from repeated practice of creating interfaces, which is a bit different from the typical programming experience. I actually believe that most front-end developers expand their knowledge of CSS on the job, and that's totally sufficient in most cases. So you don't need to be a master of CSS, but you shouldn't get stumped on the basics like CSS selectors and basic specificity rules. I just don't want someone that's completely lacking in basic knowledge, as it does take a fair amount of time to ramp up on CSS for the first time. The ideal candidate would be able to take a simple mockup, like a button or a UI element, and code it with HTML and CSS quickly without having to repeatedly Google stuff to get the CSS right. Guiding principle number 3 is to actually know how to code. Now, I can easily determine this with a small coding challenge, but I'm not a big advocate of coding challenges as the sole mechanism for determining a candidate's abilities. I'll break down the reasoning and the alternatives that I like better in another video. But if I'm part of a process that's doing coding challenges, the traits that I'm looking for is that you can establish a solid understanding of the problem, you have the ability to ask questions and investigate things for yourself, you can balance trade-offs between different approaches, and you have great coding efficacy. I don't need someone that's phenomenally fast at coding, but I need someone who is adequately capable of translating their thought into code. In essence, I don't want your coding to be an inhibitor to your thinking. Put another way, you want the interviewer to be able to focus on your thinking, not your coding ability. This leads me to my next guiding principle. Guiding principle number 4 is to know how to mitigate risks in production. This means having a track record of making decisions that reduce risks at your previous employer or past projects. Questions like, what previous tasks required you to be vigilant about robustness of a system? What kind of scaling or performance bottlenecks have you solved? How did you solve them? What were some technical challenges that took a significant amount of effort, maybe in the range of multiple months? Why was it significant? If not at a previous job, I expect a candidate's project to be filled with sound decisions that took into account the context and competing priorities that played into the decision. I want to get to know the candidate's reasoning ability and thinking process. Guiding principle number 5 is to be able to teach me something about your choice of technology. I love when people can go really deep into their domain of expertise. As a front-end developer, you're probably working in the nitty-gritty of at least one library or framework to do your work. I want to know about the trickiest problems you've solved in that context. I want to know about those messy details. I want to know that you care about those details. I want to know that you like being in the weeds on this stuff. I'm looking to learn something about the work you currently do in the interview. Because if you can teach me something and explain it well, I can trust that you'll have the independence to learn things deeply on my team and help others on the team along the way. This ability to communicate technically intricate topics is a surprisingly important skill as a software developer working with other developers. I don't want your communication to be a hiring risk. Okay, and that's it for today's video. Let me know if you have any questions or comments about the video, and I'd be happy to answer any of them. I also have an email newsletter dedicated for people who are interested in becoming a programmer. I send insights on how to be a high-performing software developer, and sometimes more generally on being a high-performing individual. I'll leave a link in the video description. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.